Have you ever found yourself sitting in a crowded room, surrounded by laughter and conversation, yet feeling as though you were watching everything through thick glass, completely separated from the warmth and connection happening around you? This is not the ordinary loneliness we sometimes experience when we're physically alone. This is something much deeper, much more profound and unsettling. It's the kind of loneliness that follows you like a shadow, whispering that no matter how hard you try, no matter how perfectly you perform, you will always be fundamentally separate, fundamentally misunderstood, fundamentally unworthy of the deep connection your soul craves. You might have learned to mask this feeling so expertly that even you don't always recognize it. You show up to social gatherings, you participate in conversations, you laugh at the right moments, but there's a part of you that remains untouched, unwitnessed, achingly alone, even in the presence of others. Perhaps you've developed such sophisticated strategies for hiding this loneliness that people often comment on how together you seem, how strong you are, how well you have everything figured out. But behind the competent facade, behind the carefully curated responses and the perfectly timed smiles, there lives a part of you that knows you are performing a role rather than living authentically. What I want to share with you today is perhaps one of the most liberating realizations you can have about this persistent companion called loneliness. It is not random. It is not evidence of your inadequacy or proof that you are somehow broken beyond repair. Your loneliness was silently programmed into your nervous system during your earliest years, installed like invisible software that has been running in the background of your consciousness ever since, shaping every relationship, every interaction, every attempt at intimacy with the quiet conviction that true belonging is somehow always just out of reach. This programming didn't happen through one dramatic event, but through thousands of tiny moments where you learned that your authentic self was somehow too much, too little, too complicated, or too simple for the people whose love felt like survival itself. Think for a moment about a young tree growing in the forest. If that tree is planted too close to a wall, its branches will naturally bend away from the obstacle, growing in whatever direction allows for survival. Years later, even when the wall is removed, the tree maintains its curved shape. The wall is gone, but its influence remains encoded in every ring, every branch, every leaf. The tree doesn't consciously remember the wall, but its entire structure bears witness to that early encounter with limitation. It has grown around an absence, shaped itself in response to something that no longer exists, but continues to determine its form. This is what happened to you as a child, except the walls were not made of stone or wood, but of emotional patterns, spoken and unspoken rules, the particular way love was or wasn't expressed in your earliest environment. These walls were often invisible, made of sighs when you were too excited, silence when you needed comfort, criticism disguised as concern, or love that seemed to evaporate whenever you showed parts of yourself that didn't fit the narrow definition of who you were supposed to be. Perhaps you learned that love was conditional, something to be earned through perfect behavior, academic achievement, or by becoming what others needed you to be. You might have discovered that your role in the family was to be the easy child, the one who didn't cause problems, who intuitively knew how to read the emotional temperature of the room and adjust accordingly. Perhaps you discovered that your authentic emotions were too much, too intense, too inconvenient for the adults around you, so you learned to compress yourself into a more manageable version, always slightly out of focus, never quite fully present. You became an expert at gauging how much of yourself was safe to reveal in any given moment, how much enthusiasm was acceptable, how much sadness could be expressed before it became burdensome, how much anger was permissible before it threatened the delicate equilibrium that everyone seemed determined to maintain. Maybe you absorbed the message that vulnerability was dangerous, that showing your true needs would lead to rejection, disappointment, or worse, the terrifying discovery that those needs might never be met at all. And so you learned to need less, to want less, to be less, mistaking this diminishment for maturity, this self-betrayal for love. These early learnings didn't happen through dramatic events or obvious trauma, though those certainly play their part. More often, this programming occurred through the subtle, repeated experiences of a developing nervous system, trying to make sense of how love works, how safety is maintained, how belonging is secured. It happened in the space between words, in the quality of attention you received or didn't receive, in the way your emotions were met or dismissed, in the thousand small moments that taught you who you needed to be to remain worthy of care. A parent who was emotionally absent not because they didn't love you, but because they were drowning in their own unresolved wounds, carrying their own inherited loneliness that made it impossible for them to see and respond to the tender being you were. A household where conflict was avoided at all costs, teaching you that your authentic feelings could disrupt the fragile peace that everyone seemed so desperately to maintain, that harmony was more important than honesty, that keeping others comfortable was more valuable than your own emotional truth. A family system where someone else's needs always came first, where your role was to be the understanding one, the mature one, the one who didn't add to the burden that everyone was already carrying, who could sense when it was appropriate to have feelings, and when those feelings needed to be stored away for a more convenient time that somehow never arrived. Maybe you grew up in a home where emotions were treated like weather, unpredictable forces that happened to people rather than valid responses to real circumstances that deserved attention and care. Perhaps you learned that your sensitivity was a liability, that your ability to feel deeply was something to be managed or medicated rather than honored as a gift. You might have absorbed the belief that successful people don't get overwhelmed, that strong people handle everything without complaint, that good people sacrifice their own needs without resentment. In these seemingly normal environments, you learn to scan for emotional weather patterns, to become exquisitely attuned to everyone else's internal state while losing connection with your own. You developed an early warning system that could detect the slightest shift in mood, the smallest sign of disapproval, the faintest indication that your presence might be too much, too needy, too complicated for those around you. This hypervigilance became second nature, an unconscious background process that consumed enormous amounts of energy as you constantly adjusted your behavior, your expression, even your thoughts to maintain the approval that felt essential for survival. You learned to be a shapeshifter, molding yourself to fit whatever seemed to be required in each moment, losing track of what you actually felt, wanted, or believed underneath all that adaptive camouflage. What you learned in those formative years was not love, though it may have been called love. What you learned was adaptation, survival, the intricate choreography of making yourself small enough, good enough, invisible enough to maintain the connection that felt like life itself. You learned that your worth was negotiable, something that could be increased through performance and decreased through authenticity. You learned that other people's emotions were your responsibility, that their comfort was more important than your truth, that harmony was more valuable than honesty. You discovered that love was something you earned rather than something you inherently deserved, that approval was conditional upon your ability to anticipate and meet others' needs before they even expressed them. You became an expert at reading between the lines, interpreting silence, detecting the subtle shifts in energy that indicated whether you were being received with warmth or merely tolerated. You learned to mistake anxiety for intuition, hypervigilance for sensitivity, people-pleasing for generosity, and underneath all of these lessons, quietly installing itself in the deepest layers of your psyche, was the fundamental belief that if people really knew you, really saw you without the carefully constructed mask you had learned to wear, they would inevitably leave. This belief became the invisible filter through which you experienced every relationship, the lens that made genuine intimacy feel simultaneously like the thing you craved most and the thing you feared most. You learned to love conditionally because that's how you experienced being loved, to withhold parts of yourself because fullness felt dangerous, to settle for connection that required you to stay partially hidden rather than risk the terrifying vulnerability of being completely seen. This programming was so subtle, so pervasive, so normalized in the environment where you developed that you likely never questioned it. It felt like truth rather than conditioning, like reality rather than one particular family's way of avoiding the discomfort of authentic emotional intimacy. I want to pause for a moment and ask you directly, can you remember the first time you realized that being yourself wasn't safe? That moment when you understood, perhaps not consciously but in the wordless knowing of your body, that your authentic expression was somehow a threat to the love you needed to survive? Maybe it was when your excitement was met with irritation, when your sadness was dismissed as drama, when your anger was labeled as bad behavior that needed to be corrected rather than a legitimate response to something that wasn't right in your world. I know this recognition can be profoundly painful. You might be realizing right now that the loneliness you've carried isn't evidence of your failure to connect, but evidence of your success in adapting to an environment that couldn't hold the fullness of who you were. The very strategies that helped you survive as a child, the emotional reflexes that kept you safe in a world where safety felt precarious, have become the invisible barriers that now stand between you and the deep intimacy your adult self craves. I want you to know that this pattern is not your fault and it is not permanent. That the loneliness you feel is not a reflection of your unworthiness, but a signal from your deepest self that you are ready to reclaim the parts of you that were sacrificed for survival. And that's why I'd like to invite you to share a fragment of your recognition in the comments below. You can simply copy this phrase and complete it. I learned that love wasn't safe when, by doing this, you not only begin to name the invisible programming that has shaped your relationships, but you also offer permission to someone else who might be watching this, wondering if they are the only one who feels like an imposter in their own life. Your willingness to acknowledge this pattern might be exactly the validation someone needs to begin their own journey of unraveling the beliefs that have kept them isolated in plain sight. This community of recovering people-pleasers, of former emotional caretakers, of those who learned too early that their needs were too much grows stronger every time we recognize the common threads in our stories. We begin to see that our loneliness was never proof of our inadequacy, but evidence of our profound sensitivity, our early recognition that something in our environment wasn't quite right, wasn't quite safe for the tender truth of who we were. Now, let's continue exploring what happens when you begin to understand that the loneliness you've carried is not a life sentence, but an invitation to return home to yourself. The most revolutionary thing you can understand about this childhood programming is that it was never really about you. The emotional climate you absorbed, the rules you learned about how love works, the beliefs you developed about your own worthiness. These were inherited patterns passed down through generations of people who were doing the best they could with their own unhealed wounds. Your mother's inability to hold space for your emotions likely stemmed from her own childhood experience of having her feelings dismissed or minimized, perhaps by parents who themselves never learned that emotions were information rather than inconvenience. Your father's emotional unavailability probably reflected his own early learning, that vulnerability was weakness, that providing meant performing, that love was expressed through doing rather than being, lessons passed down from fathers and grandfathers who learned to equate emotional expression with feminine weakness in a culture that punished men for having feelings. The family system that taught you to prioritize everyone else's needs was likely built on generations of people who learned that their own needs were selfish, that good people sacrifice themselves for others, that love means disappearing into service, particularly if you were raised female in a lineage where women's worth was measured by their capacity for self-erasure. These patterns often stretch back through family lines like invisible threads, connecting you to great-grandparents you never met, who made similar adaptations to survive their own challenging circumstances. Perhaps your great-grandmother learned to be small and accommodating, to survive an era when women had no legal rights, no economic independence, no choice but to ensure their acceptability at all costs. Maybe your grandfather learned to suppress his sensitivity to survive a war, economic hardship, or simply the brutal emotional landscape of early 20th century masculinity that demanded stoicism over authenticity. These survival strategies, born out of real necessity in their original context, become the water in which subsequent generations swim, the invisible assumptions about how relationship works that nobody ever questions because everyone seems to share them. What was adaptive in one generation becomes limitation in the next. What ensured survival for your ancestors may now be preventing the very intimacy and authentic connection your soul longs to experience. Understanding this generational component doesn't minimize the impact these patterns had on your developing sense of self, but it does something revolutionary. It personalizes the wound while depersonalizing the cause, allowing you to feel the full extent of how these patterns affected you, while simultaneously recognizing that they were never a reflection of your inherent value or lovability. This understanding doesn't excuse the impact these patterns had on your developing sense of self, but it does something even more important. It reveals that the loneliness you feel is not evidence of some fundamental flaw in your design, but the natural result of a nervous system that learned to expect disconnection, to anticipate rejection, to prepare for the inevitable moment when your true self would be too much for others to bear. Your hypervigilance in relationships, your tendency to scan for signs that people are pulling away, your exhausting habit of trying to prevent abandonment by abandoning yourself first. These are not character defects. They are survival strategies that made perfect sense in the context where they were developed. But here is where the real work begins, where the journey from loneliness to authentic connection becomes possible. Once you recognize that your relational patterns are not permanent fixtures of your personality, but learned responses that can be updated, you begin to reclaim your power. You start to see that the voice in your head that whispers you are too much, too needy, too complicated, is not your voice at all, but the internalized criticism of people who were themselves struggling with their own unresolved shame and fear. You begin to understand that the loneliness you feel in relationships is not because you are inherently unlovable, but because you have been relating to others from behind the protective wall of who you learned you needed to be, rather than the vulnerable truth of who you actually are. This realization can feel simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it means the loneliness is not permanent, not an unchangeable feature of your existence. Terrifying because it means that creating authentic connection will require you to risk the very thing your nervous system was programmed to avoid: showing up as yourself, with your needs, your feelings, your complicated humanity, trusting that real love can hold all of it. It means learning to distinguish between the reasonable caution of an adult who chooses relationships wisely and the hyper-vigilant terror of a child who believes that authenticity equals abandonment. The path forward involves developing what we might call emotional discernment, the ability to distinguish between people who are capable of meeting you in authentic relationship and those who, because of their own unhealed wounds, need you to remain small, manageable, and accommodating. This discernment requires you to become intimately familiar with your own inner landscape, to recognize the difference between the fear that's trying to keep you safe and the fear that's trying to keep you small. It means learning to trust the subtle signals from your nervous system that tell you when someone feels genuinely safe versus when someone feels familiar in the way that old patterns feel familiar. Often, the people who feel immediately comfortable are those who unconsciously invite you to repeat the same relational dynamics that created your loneliness in the first place, while the people who feel slightly uncomfortable might simply be unfamiliar in their capacity to actually see and receive you as you are. This path requires immense patience with yourself as you slowly, carefully begin to experiment with showing up more authentically in small, safe ways. It might mean practicing saying no to requests that don't align with your actual capacity, even when saying no feels selfish or wrong. It might involve sharing a feeling you would normally keep to yourself, expressing a preference you would usually deny having, or asking for something you need, rather than hoping someone will guess. These seemingly small acts of authenticity can feel revolutionary to a nervous system that learned early that survival depended on accurate performance of an acceptable self. This process often requires you to grieve the child who learned too early that love was conditional, who adapted so completely to an environment that couldn't hold their full expression that they forgot what their authentic preferences even were. This grieving is not self-pity or dwelling on the past, but a necessary acknowledgement of what was lost when you learned that survival required self-betrayal. You might need to feel the anger that you weren't allowed to feel then, the sadness that was dismissed as too much, the fear that was minimized or pathologized rather than met with comfort and understanding. You might need to mourn the friendships you couldn't fully engage in because you were too afraid of being too much, the romantic relationships where you loved the idealized version of someone rather than risking the vulnerability of being known, the family gatherings where you performed the role of who you were supposed to be rather than bringing who you actually were. This grieving is not a sign that you are moving backwards or becoming more damaged. It is evidence that your psyche is finally safe enough to process the experiences that were too overwhelming to feel at the time. It's a sign that you are developing the internal capacity to hold your own emotional experience with compassion rather than judgment, to witness your own pain with the tenderness that was missing when you were small and needed it most. As you do this work, you may discover that the loneliness you've carried begins to shift into something else entirely. Not the absence of longing, but a different kind of aloneness, one that feels spacious rather than claustrophobic, connected to yourself rather than severed from everything. You begin to understand that the deepest intimacy you've been seeking cannot be found by convincing others to love you despite your needs, but by learning to love yourself enough to share those needs with people who have the capacity to meet them with presence rather than performance anxiety. This shift from seeking to be loved despite who you are to being loved because of who you are represents a fundamental revolution in how relationship works. Instead of trying to earn love through perfection, you begin to understand that real love is actually drawn to authenticity, that the very qualities you learned to hide might be exactly what makes you most lovable to people who are capable of real intimacy. The loneliness that was programmed in childhood was teaching you that love required you to disappear. The solitude you can cultivate as an adult teaches you that love requires you to appear, to show up, to trust that your authentic presence is not a burden to be managed but a gift to be received by those who have done their own work of returning home to themselves. In this space, connection becomes possible not because you have finally learned to be lovable, but because you have remembered that you always were. This remembering is not a return to some mythical past self who was perfect before the world wounded you, but a recognition that underneath all the adaptive strategies and protective mechanisms, the essential you was always worthy of love, always valuable, always enough. What emerges from this understanding is not the elimination of loneliness, but the transformation of loneliness from a source of shame into a doorway to deeper intimacy. You begin to see that the very sensitivity that made you so attuned to others' emotional needs is also what makes you capable of profound connection when you learn to extend that same attention to yourself. The hypervigilance that once exhausted you becomes discernment that helps you recognize who is capable of real relationship and who is still operating from their own unhealed programming. The depth of feeling that you learn to hide becomes the foundation for relationships that can hold the full spectrum of human experience without breaking. Your capacity for empathy, refined through years of trying to ensure others' comfort, becomes a superpower when directed toward yourself and shared with people who can appreciate rather than exploit it. This journey from childhood programming to adult authenticity is not a linear path with a clear destination. It is more like learning to dance with your own complexity, to hold both the wounded child who learned that love was dangerous and the emerging adult who is discovering that real love is actually the safest thing in the world. It requires patience with yourself as you unlearn patterns that have been running for decades, compassion for the parts of you that still expect rejection, and courage to keep showing up even when your nervous system is convinced that authenticity equals annihilation. Some days you will feel like you've made tremendous progress, that you've finally cracked the code of authentic relationship. Other days, you might find yourself reverting to old patterns, people-pleasing, scanning for disapproval, editing yourself to fit what you think others want to hear. This is not failure. This is not evidence that you're not healing fast enough or thoroughly enough. This is simply what it looks like to be human, working with nervous system patterns that were laid down when you were too young to choose them consciously. But perhaps most importantly, it requires you to understand that the loneliness you have carried is not evidence that you are broken or defective or somehow fundamentally unfit for human connection. It is evidence that you are exquisitely sensitive to the difference between real love and its many counterfeits, between authentic intimacy and the performance of relationship. Your loneliness has been protecting you from settling for connections that would require you to abandon yourself, keeping you available for the kind of love that can meet you exactly where you are, needs and all. In this way, your loneliness has been a guardian rather than an enemy, a fierce protector of your authentic self who refused to let you settle for relationships that would require you to disappear. When you begin to see it this way, you might feel a wave of gratitude for this part of you that has been so dedicated to preserving your essential self through all the years when you thought it was evidence of your failure to connect properly. The most beautiful thing about this recognition is that as you begin to heal your own relationship with love, as you learn to show up authentically and attract people who can do the same, you become part of the solution to the epidemic of loneliness that so many people are experiencing. Your willingness to be real becomes an invitation for others to drop their own masks. Your capacity to hold space for your own complicated emotions becomes a model for how relationships can actually work when both people are committed to truth rather than performance. You become living proof that it is possible to be fully yourself and fully loved, not despite your needs and feelings and complexity, but because of the beautiful way these elements combine to create the unique expression of consciousness that is you. If these reflections on childhood programming and the journey from loneliness to authentic connection have touched something within you, know that you are not alone in recognizing these patterns in your own life. This path of unlearning the beliefs that keep us isolated and relearning how to show up authentically can feel overwhelming when we try to walk it alone, especially when the people around us haven't yet begun their own journey of returning to themselves. By subscribing to the channel, you become part of a growing community of people who are committed to healing the wounds that keep us separate, to understanding the difference between the love we learn to accept and the love we are actually worthy of receiving. Each video we share is an invitation to go deeper into this work, to explore with honesty and compassion the places where we learn to hide, and to discover together what becomes possible when we have the courage to emerge from those hiding places. We're not here to offer quick fixes or simple solutions to what is ultimately the profound work of reclaiming your authentic self. We're here to remind you that your sensitivity is not a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be honored, that your depth is not too much but exactly what this world needs, that your longing for real connection is not evidence of your inadequacy, but proof of your wisdom. If you recognize yourself in the story of the child who learned that love required disappearing, if you're ready to begin the revolutionary work of showing up as yourself, this channel is your companion on that journey. Subscribe and allow yourself to be held by reflections that understand both the challenge and the extraordinary beauty of becoming who you were always meant to be before the world taught you that you needed to be someone else. Together, we are remembering what it means to love and be loved without the armor of performance, to connect without the exhaustion of people-pleasing, to belong to ourselves so fully that we can finally belong with others. A simple click on the subscription button is a quiet declaration that you are ready to reclaim the parts of yourself that were sacrificed for survival, ready to discover what love feels like when it doesn't require you to disappear, and that, in a world where so many people are lonely despite being constantly connected, is perhaps the most radical and healing gift we can offer each other.